Good afternoon, SoFA. I hope you can all hear me okay. So yes, this is a talk about the Star of Bethlehem, and in particular, can we find an astronomical candidate which fits the account in the Gospel of St. Matthew? But it's not only the Gospel that we are trying to fit to, because we also have another confounding factor, and that is the lyrics of various Christmas carols, in particular, this one. Join in if you wish. Okay, that's enough of that. So we'll return to the Christmas carol shortly, but let's just introduce what it is we're trying to do here. We're looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew, which talks about the Magi and the star in the east. And we're going to ask ourselves, are there astronomical candidates? Are the things that happened at around that time that would have appeared in the sky that could be interpreted as the Star of Bethlehem? So we'll have a think about how many possibilities there are, and we'll think about how well those possibilities fit the account of St. Matthew. We also need to get the dates right. It's not just a question of what might have been in the sky. The question is the timing about right for the Nativity, bearing in mind that we are not absolutely sure in which year Christ was born. And to help us visualize what the night sky might have looked like, we're going to run a little bit of planetarium software. I've got a couple of very short videos that indicates what might have been in the sky a few years BC. And then I'll have a very quick summary. So let's remind ourselves of the basic points of the account, the Gospel of St. Matthew. The principal elements that we are trying to explain, or at least match up to, are the bits in this slide that are shown in red. So we're talking about the Magi journeying to Jerusalem, prompted by the appearance of a star in the east. They saw a star in the east. They didn't follow that star. The star appeared in the east, and they went west. So they went in the opposite direction. It doesn't say in the account that they saw a star in the east and followed it. That's what it says in the Christmas carol, but that's not what actually happened. They got as far as Jerusalem and asked Herod, "What's this we hear about a new king, the birth of the king of the Jews?" But Herod didn't seem to understand what it was they were asking. He didn't know that there was a birth of the new king of the Jews. So we have to explain why the Magi thought that was the interpretation of what they saw in the sky, and we have to ask ourselves why Herod didn't come to that same conclusion. The Magi journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the south, and finally stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 things in red, the appearance in the east, interpreting it as the birth of the king of the Jews. Herod didn't seem to know what was going on. The star reappeared and the star stopped. If we can find an astronomical candidate which matches up to those 5 aspects of the account, then maybe we found something which is not necessarily the Star of Bethlehem, but certainly is a contender. Let's return to the wonderful We Three Kings, and here just listen to the lyrics of the first verse. Right, we three kings of Orient are. If you actually have a look at the account, I'm not really a biblical scholar, but I did just a little bit of digging to make sure I've got my facts right. The account doesn't talk about 3. Doesn't talk about 3 wise men, doesn't talk about 3 magi. There is no mention of how many people came to visit Christ. All that's mentioned in the account is that they bought 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if there were 3 gifts, it's simply assumed that there were 3 magi, 3 wise men. It could have been that there were actually 20 people, and 17 didn't bring gifts, and only 3 did, because they weren't told they were supposed to bring gifts. So we shouldn't really, when thinking about the Christmas carol, we shouldn't really include the word 3, because there's no indication that 3 people visited Christ during the Nativity. So we should get rid of 3. And where do you get kings from? No, the Bible, the account of St. Matthew, talks about magi, the plural of magus, wise man. So definitely wise men, but kings? No indication there are kings. So we should take that out of the Christmas carol as well. Where did these people come from? Well, they might have come from Persia, they might have come from India, they might have come from Outer Mongolia. Again, the account does not say. So whether you treat the Orient as simply somewhere over there, or whether you think of the Orient as a geographic location, well, we don't really know where the wise men came from. So we shouldn't really talk about a geographic location either. And when they saw the star in the east, they didn't follow it. They saw the star in the east and went in the opposite direction. So in a sense, they didn't follow the star. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces in terms of accuracy. And I'm a scientist, I'm a physicist, I like accuracy, I like precision. So I'm suggesting that we change the Christmas carol to something which is actually accurate. We don't say we 3 kings of Orient are. We say we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin saw a star. And now you can see why physicists do not write Christmas carols, because it does not meter quite as well as we 3 kings of Orient are. And whenever we talk about the 3 wise men, we should remind ourselves that 3 is an arbitrary number. It's just the number of gifts, not the number of men. And therefore, we really ought to talk about the n wise men, where n is a number bigger than 1 and less than infinity. It's bigger than 1 because magi is plural, and therefore it's multiple. It's not just 1 wise man, and the gender was male, according to how it was written in the account. So n wise men visited Christ. When thinking about the Star of Bethlehem, we have to remind ourselves that star in the modern sense is not necessarily what was meant many, many centuries ago. So we currently think of star as being, well, our sun is a star, it's undergoing thermonuclear fusion, providing heat and light for the Earth and for the other planets. But star in past centuries has meant other things, because the word star effectively just meant something in the night sky. And some of these have actually ended up in our current vocabulary. So if you go back far enough, you find wandering star, not the Lee Marvin version, but basically there are certain stars in fixed orientations relative to each other. They're not fixed in the sky in the sense that as the Earth rotates, all the stars seem to move, but they're fixed relative to each other in patterns that we call constellations. But any apparent star, any dot of light that doesn't seem fixed but moves between constellations up and down the zodiac, well, they were called wandering stars. We now call them planets because we know what they are, but wandering star was their original designation. And similarly, some stars seem to have tails, or broom stars they might have been known as, or hairy stars. We now call them comets because we have a much better idea of what they are. Small icy bodies get close to the sun, the ice vaporizes, and we get sometimes a beautiful tail, depending on how much ice is involved and how close to the sun it gets. Comets are a little bit like cats. They have tails, and they're unpredictable. Unpredictable in the sense that we don't know how long the tail is going to be. The comets might go round the sun and revisit us or the sun every once in a while. We know, we can calculate how they go round the sun. It's very difficult to predict or work backwards and say how bright a comet might have been in the sky. So we know where the comets were. It's very difficult to work out how bright they would have been, and hence how significant they might have been. And a third example, which is one that's still in the current vernacular, is shooting star. This is still something that we occasionally use. When we see a meteor in the sky, we might refer to it as a shooting star. So star means almost anything in the night sky. Basically, anything in the night sky other than the moon, which is bright enough and obvious enough to have its own category. Apart from that, anything else you see in the night sky could be referred to as a star. And we have to take the Star of Bethlehem in that context. Do we learn anything by looking at artistry of the Adoration of the Magi? Well, not really, because of course these paintings were made centuries after the Nativity, many centuries, at least a millennium after the birth of Christ. It's always three kings. It's never more than three, it's never less than three, because over the centuries this idea that there were three wise men or three kings has got embedded into folklore and hence into art as well. So we see the Adoration of the Magi, and usually we see a star somewhere at the top of the painting. In this particular case, by Botticelli, again we see the Adoration of the Magi. There's Joseph at the back looking very bored, not taking part in any of these celebrations apparently. Perhaps that's appropriate, because allegedly he didn't have any part to play in the conception either, so maybe this is all right. It's also thought that that person on the right staring at the artist is actually Botticelli himself. Again, there's a star just out of picture, as it were, shining down on the baby Jesus. There's generally a star somewhere depicted in most of the depictions of the Adoration of the Magi. Only one shows the star as apparently not a stellar star, not a star in the current sense. Giotto, 1305, indicates that the star looks more like a comet. So this is an admission, if you like, that maybe the Star of Bethlehem wasn't a star or a planet, but might have been a comet. Most other people, most other artists, stick with the convention of just showing a star in the sky. Rubens, I'm not sure quite what he was painting, but I don't actually see a star in the sky up there. It appears to be missing. One of the few paintings of the Adoration of the Magi which does not include the Star of Bethlehem. But at the back, there does appear to be a two-headed camel, which makes up for the fact that there's no star in the background, perhaps. So we have to think about astrological significance, because of course astronomy is a relatively modern science in the sense that it's been modern for 1,000 years or so, but if you go back to many, many centuries ago, then astrology ruled rather than astronomy. Astrology meaning look at the sky and deduce some significance into how the sky has arranged itself. Every planet, every bright star, every constellation, especially those that are in the zodiac, those constellations in which the planets go backwards and forwards because we're all orbiting the sun in roughly the same plane, and therefore the planets appear to move backwards and forwards across 12 or possibly 13 constellations in the zodiac rather than the other constellations in the sky. But every planet, every star, every constellation had some sort of astrological significance that the Magi would have been aware of. For instance, Venus, the planet Venus, otherwise known as Aphrodite, so Venus associated with beauty and fertility and birth. Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, the same god, if you like, as the god Zeus, associated with royalty, basically the head god, if you like, of the time, the king of planets in a sense. Regulus is a star. It's the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and you can perhaps get a hint from its name, the first three letters of its name, that Regulus is considered to be the king of stars. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the brightest. It has somehow become associated with royalty and being a king. So Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, is associated with being a king. And Leo itself is, because of the outline of stars in Leo, which we'll see in a little while, it looks a little bit like a lion, and a lot of different cultures have interpreted that particular constellation as a lion, and it bears a striking resemblance to the flag and the identity of the land and the people of Judea, because they associated themselves with the Lion of Judea. So Leo has become associated with the land of the Jews, the land of Judea. Why did people assume astrological significance for whatever was happening in the sky? It was because people wanted to know, what does God have in store for us? What's coming next? Are the crops going to fail? Are we going to have a famine? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have an earthquake? If you want to know what's coming, you look in the sky and you read the signs which tells you what's coming up. In other words, before God actually does anything that affects mankind, he posts it on the sky. It's a bit like saying it's basically the sky is God's Facebook page. That's where he says this is what's going to happen in the next few months or the next few years. Good news or bad news, it's all written in the stars, if you want to think of it that way. Therefore, astrologers will take careful note of the sky in order that they can either decide for themselves what to do or advise their ruler of whichever country they happen to live in as to what's going to happen next. So let's have a think about what possible candidates exist for the Star of Bethlehem. What are the possibilities? We're going to have a look at a few candidates and ask ourselves, does it meet the criterion of appearing as a star in the east? Would it have been thought of as significant? Is it plausible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Could that star reappear in the sky? And could that star stop in the sky? So let's have a think of a few possibilities. Could the Star of Bethlehem be a shooting star? Well, meteor showers happen all the time. There are a dozen or so meteor showers where lots of meteors appear in a given night. There'll be a dozen or so throughout the year, scattered over the year. Meteors appear virtually all over the sky. So there's no real reason why you would ever say, look, there's a star in the east, because you won't find meteors only appearing in the east. They'll be everywhere. Are they significant? Well, if meteor showers happen pretty much at the same time every year, year on year on year, they might be a little more spectacular one year than the next. More meteors might appear this year than next year, but there's no reason why the appearance of meteors, shooting stars, are not really significant. So it's quite reasonable that Herod wouldn't be aware of them because there's no significance to that particular appearance. Meteors flash across the sky, so why would you ever talk about a star stopping in the sky? Excuse me, I should have dealt with the reappearance first. Yes, meteors will appear in the sky and meteor showers come and go. Therefore, you might see some meteors one night and then see some more meteors a month or so later. So yes, they can reappear in the sky. But given that we've got these meteors flashing over the sky, why would you ever say that a star stopped in the sky? No meteors ever stop. They flash across the sky, they burn up, they're gone. So that doesn't seem to fit. What about the appearance of a comet in the night sky? Could a comet appear in the east? Yes, comets can appear pretty much anywhere in the sky, so yes, a comet could appear in the east. Would it have been considered significant by astrologers? Well, yes, if it was bright enough. Faint comets that you can hardly see wouldn't be thought of as significant, but a bright comet, yes. But then we have a problem with the next column. Herod wasn't aware of it. If it's a really bright comet, meaning very significant, why wouldn't Herod be aware of said comet? Herod didn't have very good eyesight, but he did have a whole court of astrologers, and they would have advised him, sire, something has just appeared in the night sky that looks very bright and very significant. So those two don't seem to go together. If it was significant, how come the astrologers of Herod's court weren't aware of it? Can the star reappear in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun, and every once in a while the comet might disappear behind the sun where you can't see it, and then reappear on the other side, perhaps weeks, perhaps months later. So yes, a comet can reappear in the sky. But given that comets are always in motion, it doesn't seem very likely that you could describe the comet as stopping in the sky. They don't move very fast relative to everything else in the night sky, so maybe that cross at the end should be more of a question mark rather than an X. What about a nova, a new star? A new star is not new in the sense that it's come into being. A nova is a star that's become visible that wasn't visible before. We now know that some stars flare up in brightness and then go dim again, and then perhaps flare up in brightness again every once in a while. So we now understand the astrophysics, we now understand the reason why that might happen, but is it possible that a star popped into existence in the sense of being visible in the night sky where previously no star was known about? It looks like a new star has arrived in a constellation. Well, such a star could in principle appear anywhere in the sky, so yes, it could appear in the east. If it was bright enough, it might be considered significant. If it's barely visible to the naked eye, it's unlikely they would have attached much significance to it. But if it was bright, yes, they could say it's significant. Then again, we have the problem. If it's bright enough for the Magi to say, look, there's a really bright new star just appeared, why didn't the astrologers see it from Herod's court? Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, nova brighten and then get dim again on scales of perhaps weeks, perhaps a little more. It is possible for a nova to brighten again, but normally that's many, many, many years later, perhaps tens of years later, perhaps hundreds of years later. It's unlikely that the star would have brightened again fairly soon after the first sighting. So that doesn't seem likely. And given that this is a new star that's appeared in some constellation or another, it's in the same position every night. Every time you see it, it's in the same position. This star is not wandering, it's not a planet, it's a star. So why would you describe the star as stopping in the sky? Because it's fixed like all the other stars in the sky, other than planets and comets and things like that. So that doesn't seem to fit either. What about a supernova? A supernova is a star that's come to the end of its life and effectively has used up its nuclear fuel and gone bang and blown itself to pieces. It's like a nova other than it is very much brighter. And if a supernova goes off in our galaxy, it'll be a very bright object and a very significant object. So yes, it could appear in the east. Yes, it would be significant. If it's really that bright, why isn't Herod aware of it? And could it reappear in the sky? Well, a supernova is a star that's blown itself to pieces. Generally speaking, they don't do it twice. Once they've blown themselves to pieces, that's it. No more supernova. So it can't reappear, and again, it's a fixed point in the sky. Why would you describe it as stopping in the sky if it's fixed like all the other stars? So that doesn't fit either. Perhaps not surprisingly, the fifth one in this list is the one that I think is the most interesting and the most plausible. And that is a conjunction of planets. Planets go around the sun. Every once in a while, planets seem to be in the same patch of sky. It's purely a line of sight thing because they don't physically get any closer, but as seen from Earth, planets might be apparently a long way apart, or every once in a while they might seem to occupy the same little patch of sky and seem to get very close to each other. For various planets in the solar system, could that happen in the east? Yes. Would it be significant? Well, it depends. Remember the astrological significance? It depends on which planet is in conjunction with which planet happening in which constellation. So depending on how you interpret that, you could regard that as significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, perhaps Herod's astrologers looked at the same event and saw the same planets in motion, but didn't necessarily assign the same astrological significance to it. So it is possible that Herod was not aware of what the Magi were talking about. Can the star reappear in the sky? Yes, planets are continuously in motion around the sun. Two planets can come together and then separate, and then later those two planets can appear in the patch of sky again. So conjunctions can reoccur. Yep, the star can reappear in the sky. And as we'll see shortly, it's also possible for a planet to, quote, stop in the sky. To understand that, let's just have a little bit of basic astronomy. Here's two hypothetical planets going around the sun. The key observation when you're looking at planets going around the sun is that planets closer to the sun move faster, as indicated by the green planet moving faster than the red planet. Not only has it got not as far to go, it's actually moving faster. So you can see that at some points these planets are in different parts of the sky, but at different times, sometimes these planets seem to be in the same chunk of sky. Usually the planets are in orbits which are not quite in the same plane. Most of the planets go round the sun in what you might think of as the horizontal plane, the same plane as the Earth going round the sun. But they're all slightly tilted, which means quite often planets just slightly miss each other when they apparently get close to each other. The second thing to bear in mind when we're talking about planets going round the sun is that if we think of the green planet as being Earth, where we're making the observations from, and the red planet is some planet outside the orbit of the Earth, so it could be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, remember, the green planet is moving faster than the red planet. And they're all going, in this sense, anti-clockwise, as seen from above, in inverted commas. So the red planet, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, whatever it is moving slowly from west to east across the sky. But every once in a while, you get this situation where the Earth overtakes it, or undertakes it, if you like. The Earth is on the inside track, and the Earth is going a lot faster because it's closer to the sun. So although most of the time the red planet seems to be moving from west to east, every once in a while the Earth goes a little bit faster, and so the planet seems to move backwards. It's purely a perspective effect. The planet itself is just doing its own thing, going around the sun, but if the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane, then for a little while the planet can seem to go backwards in the sky. It's called retrograde motion. So what we actually see on the sky is the planet appears to move from west to east most of the time, but every once in a while it appears to stop in the sky, go backwards for a while, stop again, and then continue moving forwards in its normal so-called prograde direction. Let's just run that animation again. It normally goes from west to east, but every once in a while, because the Earth overtakes it, it stops, goes backwards for a few months, and then starts to go forward again. That happens for all planets that have orbits outside the orbit of the Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc. So now that we understand how planets move, we can get a better understanding of what's actually going on. Let's think about the timing. Let's think about what happened when. Here's a timescale of a few years BC. Because of the way calendars work, because of the way calendars have changed, we don't think Christ was born in 1 AD. One thing you notice, by the way, there's no year 0. If you go backwards from 2 AD, you get to 1 AD. If you go backwards from 1 AD, you don't get to 0, you go immediately to 1 BC. There was no year 0. Some pieces of software, like the one that you might have on your phone telling you what the night sky looks like, some bits of software don't get that right. And if you dial the clock back to what happened in this sort of period, if you don't account for the fact that there was no year 0, you might be off by 1 year. So when was Christ born? We don't know. A lot of biblical scholars seem to think that Christ was probably born somewhere between 4 BC and 8 BC, between 8 and 4 BC. We don't really know, partly because we don't know exactly when King Herod died. A lot of the events of Christ's early life is based on when did King Herod die, because Christ was born before King Herod died. But we don't have a date for King Herod. It's not etched into a tablet somewhere, King Herod died in 4 BC. No, for obvious reasons, we don't have that sort of identification. Basically, King Herod died in the year that had an eclipse in the spring that followed a flood that came after the famine that came after, whatever. A whole series of events leads you to the year in which King Herod died. Some biblical scholars, I'm not a biblical scholar, it's just something I've read from other people, some people believe that when you're dating the death of King Herod, you've got to get the right eclipse. And if you get the wrong eclipse, you find that he didn't die in 4 BC, he died in about 1 BC. Which means it might be possible that Christ was actually born between 3 and 1 BC rather than between 8 and 4 BC. Quite why there's a gap there between 3 and 4, I don't know, but those are, as far as many people are concerned, those are the possibilities. So what was in the sky around this time? Well, there were comets around. There was a comet around in 12 BC. We know how comets move. We can work out where they are now, and we can dial the clock back 2,000 years and say that comet was in the sky. That is Halley's Comet. And Halley's Comet was probably quite bright. But 12 BC, isn't that a bit early for God to be posting this on Facebook to say something interesting is going to happen? Other comets appeared at about the right time, 5 BC and 4 BC. One of these is Comet Holmes, which appeared a few years back. And the other one is the comet with the wonderful name of Churyumov-Gerasimenko. Churyumov-Gerasimenko, yeah, that sounds about right. It's the one that Rosetta visited. The Rosetta spacecraft visited this comet and put a little lander on it. It's otherwise known as 67P. But neither of those comets are particularly large. Neither of them have particularly spectacular tails. If they were in the sky in 4 and 5 BC, they would not have been spectacular. So it's not likely to be those either. There were nova around. The Chinese saw a nova in 5 BC and the Koreans saw a nova in 4 BC. Nova, bright ones in particular, don't come around that often. So is this like buses? You wait for ages and then 2 come along in close succession? It's more likely that somewhere along the line the dating has got a little bit wrong. They're probably seeing the same nova, and for some reason the calendars are off by a few months. They probably saw a nova around 4 or 5 BC. But we've already said nova don't fit the bill because nova would be fixed in the sky. But when we look at conjunctions, and here I'm using astrological symbols just for brevity, that symbol means conjunction, and the curly 4 is shorthand for Jupiter, and the curly H is shorthand for Saturn. And perhaps you're more familiar with the symbol for Venus there on the right. So we know that there were 2 sets of interesting conjunctions, one around 5 or 6 BC, and one around 1 or 2 BC. Some people think this conjunction might have been the one that started the story of the Star of Bethlehem. That might be true, but I think that conjunction is much more interesting for reasons I'm about to show you by looking at some software that tells us what the sky looked like. So I'm not going to show the entire sky. I'm not going to show the horizon because I'm going to be moving forward weeks and months at a time, and I don't want the horizon to keep moving backwards and forwards as we flick through night after night after night. I'm just going to look at one patch of sky, which is where all the action is. And this patch of sky involves the constellation of Leo. There's the head of Leo, the front paws, that's Regulus, and then the back end of the lion. So most people see this constellation of Leo as a lion. There's other zodiac constellations there. There's Cancer, Libra further on, etc. I'm also not going to label all the planets in the solar system because all the planets are going to be going around the sun. They're going to be flashing across the screen. The zodiac moves effectively this way, so the planets will be moving from right to left most of the time. And I'm not going to label them all, otherwise the labels get very confusing. The only thing I have labeled is the planet Jupiter. Coming up behind it is the planet Venus. And this is what the sky looked like. I realize you can't read this even from the front. You probably can't read it. I have set the sky to show me what's happening in August of 3 BC at about tea time. And I'm looking to see what the planets are doing. So let's run this clock forward. Basically, every second will be quite a few days. And let's see what happens to the planets. Jupiter is moving west to east, i.e. right to left, but Venus is coming up behind it. So Venus and Jupiter now very close in the sky. This is in August the 12th, 3 BC. Venus and Jupiter are very close in the sky, close enough that they are just a fraction separated, just a fraction of the full moon. You might just about be able to get your little finger between them when you look into the sky. Venus and Jupiter are the 2 brightest planets in the sky. So seeing those 2 bright lights come together might have been seen as significant. This would happen in the early morning before sunrise. So at this particular date, at this particular time, this particular conjunction would have been seen in the early morning sky before the sun rose. It's a star in the east. What is the star? It's Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Constellation of Leo, the land of Judea. Birth, king, Jew. So that particular star appearing in the east could have been astrologically interpreted as something interesting is about to happen, and it involves the birth of the King of the Jews. Okay, the astrologers say, let's keep an eye on the sky to see what we learn by watching it for a few more months. Venus is going around the sun quite fast. Remember, the inner planets move quickly, so Venus is hurtling off to the left. Jupiter has now passed the star Regulus, the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. Remember, Regulus is the king of stars. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars, and Jupiter now stops in the sky. It was moving west to east. It's now stopped and is now moving back to the right. So it's moving in the so-called retrograde motion. It's moving backwards, and Jupiter is about to pass Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars a second time. And then Jupiter stops in the sky again and resumes its normal motion from west to east, from right to left, and Jupiter passes Regulus a third time. The king of planets has passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times in succession over a few months after seeing this original star in the east, signifying the birth of the King of the Jews. So that might make the astrologers think, well, there's something definitely interesting going on here. It looks like one king is going to pass power, or the crown, over to another king. We really need to talk to Herod about what's going on over in the land of Judea. They watch the sky for a little more, thinking, well, when should we go see Herod? Now, or do we wait for a sign? They waited for a little while, perhaps, and along comes Venus, because it's gone round the sun and it's back again. There's Venus. It's now in conjunction with Jupiter a second time. So yes, a star can reappear in the sky. The conjunction of Venus with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo birthed King Jews again. This time, it's even more spectacular than the previous star in the east, which they saw a few months back. We're now in summer of 2 BC. This particular conjunction was absolutely spectacular in the sense that these are not simply close in the sky, these are so close in the sky that no human could actually separate them. No human vision could actually make them out as 2 dots. These 2 dots would have merged together. They are so close in the sky. Remember, we didn't have telescopes back in these days, but if we imagine if we were to look at that Venus-Jupiter conjunction through a telescope, what would we see? Let's zoom in so we can see just how close they actually are. They are that close that the disk of Jupiter and the disk of Venus appear to be almost touching. This particular field of view is much, much, much smaller than any human can resolve. In other words, these would not have been seen as 2 dots in the sky. They would have been seen as 1 dot having merged from 2. These 2 dots, night by night, would have got closer and closer together, the 2 brightest planets in the sky, and eventually those 2 brightest planets would have merged into 1. How often does a conjunction like that take place? I'm not sure of the numbers, but I'd be surprised if a conjunction that close occurs more often than a few times in 1,000 years. It's virtually a given that the astrologers would never have seen anything like that before. This would have been the starting pistol that says, you've had the story, we've given you all the signs, now is the time to go see Herod. So, a summary of what was in the sky. There was a close but not spectacular conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo. That was the first sign that something interesting is going to happen related to the birth of the King of the Jews. Over the next few months, they watched the King of planets pass the King of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times. There's a passing of the crown from one king to another king. And then in June of 2 BC, they would have seen this spectacular conjunction where 2 planets appear to join together as 1 bright planet, something that the astrologers would never have seen before. And that was the starting pistol. How long did it take them to actually arrive at Jerusalem or Bethlehem? We have no idea. We don't know where they came from, remember? We don't know whether they came from Persia. They might have been Zoroastrian priests. They might not have been. They might have been from India. They might have been from outer Mongolia. They might have walked. They might have come on camels. I know the Christmas cards always show them on camels, but that doesn't tell you what the truth is. So we don't know how long it takes them to get there. It is possible that if they left in June, they might have got there a few months later. It's interesting to note that after the events I've just described, Jupiter stops in the sky in December. On what date does Jupiter stop in the sky? The 25th of December. Yes, I know that's just a coincidence, but it just so happens that Jupiter stops in the sky on the 25th of December. Of course, that's just an old Saturnalia, an old pagan festival that's been taken over, but it's just curious that it happens to fit, as it were, the story. So maybe what I've described. Maybe it was the conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo that basically inspired the account that eventually got woven into the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it was handed down generation after generation that people saw this light in the sky, and eventually that made it into the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a combination of the things I've described. Maybe it was a combination of a conjunction and a comet and something else. What we do know is the astronomical facts. We know the positions of the planets well enough, and we can calculate where they were in the sky to within a few seconds, to within a few minutes, we can specify where they were in the sky and what they were doing and how bright they were. Comets is more tricky, but planets is easy. 2,000 years is nothing in terms of doing these calculations. So the astronomical facts are known as to what was in the sky at the time, around 2, 3 BC or even 4 or 5 BC. But of course, trying to second guess what an astrologer might have made of those events, that is speculation. We don't know. We can simply say, well, they might have interpreted the appearance in the sky of these various events in the following way. Speculation, and we cannot be sure. So we just have to admit that we know the facts, but we don't know the interpretation. But regardless of that, what we can say is the underlying message is, of course, the same. I hope you all have a very peaceful Christmas and a Happy New Year. Thank you very much.